Imagine I give you two choices. You can hold your bare hand in a bucket of ice water for 60 seconds, or you can hold it in that exact same freezing water for 90 seconds.
I mean, basic logic says you'd pick the shorter option, right? Less pain is obviously better than more pain.
Exactly. But science says if we actually run that experiment on you, your brain will actively choose to suffer longer, which is just wild. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, it completely defies how we assume our own minds work. I mean, we all walk around believing our memory is, like a security camera, just silently rolling in the background, recording our lives minute by minute.
Right, we trust that when we look back on a vacation or a relationship or even just like a really long meeting, we're accessing a relatively accurate summary of what we actually lived through.
But we aren't. Not even close.
No, we really aren't. And since you shared your notes on UX design, medical research, and behavioral psychology with us, we found this crazy thread connecting them all. So our mission today is to uncover a massive, almost unbelievable blind spot in how you remember your own life.
Yeah, and across all these completely different fields, everything points to one radical psychological heuristic. It was formulated by Daniel Kahneman and Barbara Fredrickson, and it's known as the peak end rule.
The P-scan rule.
Exactly. The rule basically states that your memory of any experience isn't a continuous video. It's heavily dominated by just two distinct moments, the emotional peak of that experience and exactly how it ends.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand why the peak and the end carry such an absurd amount of weight, we first have to understand what the brain is actually throwing away. And that brings up a fascinating psychological phenomenon from the research called duration neglect.
Yeah, duration neglect is arguably the strangest part of this whole cognitive loop. I mean, for decades, economists and logical thinkers just assumed that human beings judge an experience by the sum of its parts.
Like a math equation.
Right, like if you have a mildly pleasant experience reading a book for 1 hour and a mildly pleasant experience reading for 2 hours, the 2 hour session should be remembered as twice as good because there's simply more total pleasure.
Makes sense on paper.
But Kahneman and Fredrickson discovered that the objective length of an experience has almost zero impact on how we actually remember it.
Because the brain, it basically refuses to keep a running tally of our feelings.
Exactly. Kahneman had to draw the sharp line between what he termed the experiencing self and the remembering self to explain this.
And the experiencing self is the one in the moment, right?
Yes. Your experiencing self lives entirely in the present tense. It registers pain, pleasure, boredom, joy second by second, but that version of you has absolutely no voice in your future choices.
Wow, none at all.
None. The remembering self is the one holding the steering wheel. It takes all those thousands of lived seconds, aggressively edits them down into a 2-point story featuring just the peak and the end, and files that away. And it is the remembering self that dictates literally every decision you will make tomorrow.
So it's like judging an entire 2-hour movie solely by its biggest explosion and then the post-credits scene, completely ignoring if the middle hour was just a total snooze fest.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. The remembering self simply does not care about the runtime of the movie. It only cares about the emotional high and the final impression.
But wait, surely if something is physically painful, making it last longer has to make it worse, right? Like, I can understand forgetting a boring middle of a movie, but if you're actively suffering, more suffering has to equal a worse memory.
What's fascinating here is that is the exact assumption Kahneman and his team tested back in 1993, and they proved it categorically false.
This is the cold water thing.
Yeah, the famous cold water experiment.
Yeah.
So they had participants submerge their hands in painfully cold water, about 14 degrees Celsius, for 60 seconds.
Oh man, 14 degrees that's cold enough that it genuinely hurts.
Oh, yeah. Your body is screaming at you to pull your hand out. It is a highly aversive experience.
Sounds completely miserable.
It is. Now, for the second trial, the researchers had those same individuals do the exact same thing. Hand plunged into 14-degree water for 60 seconds. But instead of letting them take it out at the 1-minute mark, the researchers kept the hands submerged for an additional 30 seconds, while the water was slowly warmed by just 1 single degree, up to 15 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so to be clear, 15 degrees is still painfully cold water. The participants are just trapped in slightly less freezing water for a total of 90 seconds instead of 60.
Exactly.
So the experiencing self is objectively enduring more total pain across a longer time frame.
Objectively more pain for a longer duration, yes. But when the researchers later asked those participants which of the two trials they would prefer to repeat, a significant majority chose the longer 90-second trial.
Which is wild. They actively volunteered for more total suffering.
Because they were not consulting their experiencing self to make that decision, they asked their remembering self. And the remembering self looked at the two options entirely differently.
Because of how they ended.
Right. The first option ended abruptly at maximum pain. The second option ended with a feeling of slight relative relief as the water warmed that 1 degree. The milder ending lowered the average of the peak and the end, making the overall memory of the longer trial feel way less traumatic.
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because adding pain to make a memory better isn't just some weird parlor trick you play with college students and buckets of ice water in a lab.
No, not at all.
This translates directly to high-stakes, life-and-death applications in the real world. Let's look at that clinical trial from 2003 involving 682 patients undergoing a colonoscopy.
Which is a notoriously uncomfortable and invasive procedure, especially back in the early 2000s before the widespread use of deep unconscious sedation.
Exactly. So the researchers took these hundreds of patients and split them into two groups. Half received the standard colonoscopy procedure, but for the other half, the doctors did something that almost sounds like it violates the Hippocratic Oath.
It really does sound crazy at first.
Right. At the very end of the procedure, instead of just removing the colonoscope and letting the patient recover, they left the instrument stationary in the rectum for an additional period of time.
Which adds extra time and extra physical discomfort to a medical procedure the patient already desperately wants to be over.
I just try to imagine the pitch for that. You have patient in a highly vulnerable, uncomfortable position. The exam is technically finished, and the doctors decide to artificially prolong it.
Yeah, the experiencing self was definitely suffering more.
But because the scope wasn't moving around anymore, this extra time was only mildly uncomfortable, rather than acutely painful like the peak moments of the exam. The ending was artificially engineered to be less painful than the peak.
And the results mirror the cold water experiment with shocking accuracy. The group that endured the extended procedure, the individuals who experienced more total minutes of discomfort, rated the entire procedure as significantly less unpleasant after the fact.
And the stakes here are so much higher than just a rating on a customer satisfaction survey. The source material points out that this specific group of patients, the ones with the artificially prolonged ending, were significantly more likely to return for future, clinically recommended follow-up screenings.
Which is huge.
By designing a better memory of a terrible experience, those doctors literally saved lives.
It highlights how deeply this editing process is wired into our biology. When we look at the neuroscience supporting this, the sheer efficiency of the brain becomes apparent.
Efficiency? How so?
Well, your hippocampus, which is deeply involved in forming episodic memories, does not absorb continuous streaming data. Studies on event segmentation show that the brain actually slices continuous experiences into discrete, manageable events based on structural boundaries.
Okay, wait. I need a translation for structural boundaries. What does that actually look like in practice?
Basically, beginnings, scene changes, and endings. Whenever an environment shifts or a task concludes, the hippocampus drops a marker. That is a structural boundary.
Okay, I'm with you.
Then you have the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center. The amygdala actively monitors your biological state and tags high arousal moments, the peaks, whether they're intensely pleasurable or intensely painful, and flags them for preferential storage.
So it's sort of like a smartphone running out of storage space.
Sure.
Instead of keeping a massive 4-gigabyte 4K video of a whole concert, the brain just takes 2 high-res photos, the wildest part of the show in the finale, and then just deletes the massive video file to save battery.
That analogy hits the nail on the head, honestly, because it highlights the biological constraint we're working with here, metabolic energy.
Ah, calories.
Right. The brain consumes a massive amount of calories just to function. It is literally designed to privilege those high-effect boundaries and structural endings just to save storage space and energy for survival.
So if the remembering self only cares about these peaks and endings, and basically throws away the duration to save energy, you have to wonder how businesses and designers are exploiting this biological loophole to win our loyalty.
Oh, they exploit it ruthlessly, and often brilliantly, to be fair. In the UX and behavioral design world, this brings us to a concept known as the forgettable middle.
The forgettable middle.
Yeah, behavioral designers talk about this extensively. There's this framework called octalysis, which is basically a diagnostic tool that looks at the core psychological drives behind gamification, like why we feel compelled to complete certain tasks and ignore others.
Right.
They argue that the gap between what a customer actually experiences and what they ultimately remember is the single largest unexploited margin in modern design.
Wait, let me push back on that a second.
Yeah.
Are you saying a company should just deliver a mediocre, frustrating product as long as they throw in like a fun little animation at the end? Shouldn't a good business optimize every single step of the customer journey?
Well, it sounds ideal to optimize every single touch point, sure. But in the real world, budgets, server space, and engineering hours are finite.
Fair point.
So the concept of the forgettable middle doesn't mean the middle can be a disaster. It has to clear what behavioral designers call a competence bar.
Meaning it has to actually work.
Right. If the middle of your app or your store is so frustrating that it causes active distress, the customer will abandon the experience before they ever reach your carefully designed peak or ending.
So the checkout line can't be broken. The app can't crash. It has to be solid and functional.
Yes, it must be competent. But once it clears that bar of basic functionality, spending massive amounts of engineering or design budget to polish that middle from an 8 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10, it yields heavily shrinking returns.
Because the remembering self won't even notice.
Exactly. The remembering self simply won't notice the difference. That budget is much better spent engineering one massive, unforgettable peak and a flawless, frictionless ending.
That makes total sense when you look at massive retail examples. Like, think about navigating in IKEA.
Oh, perfect example.
It's physically exhausting. They force you into this massive maze. You're hauling around heavy flat-pack boxes. You're arguing with your partner about the dimensions of a coffee table.
It's a true test of a relationship.
It really is. The experiencing self is taking an absolute beating for 2 hours. It is a long, demanding middle. But that cheap, tasty hot dog you get right at the exit, that isn't just a random food stand they put there for extra revenue.
No, it is a highly engineered, positive ending designed specifically to rewrite the memory of that exhausting maze. You leave the store chewing a satisfying, cheap snack, and your remembering self files the entire strenuous trip away as a massive success.
Disney utilizes the exact same playbook. I mean, you spend a small fortune, you stand in the blistering sun for hours waiting for a 2-minute ride, your feet are covered in blisters, your experiencing self is miserable.
Oh, absolutely miserable.
But then the park closes with this breathtaking emotional fireworks spectacular over the castle. The peak and the end converge into one overwhelming sensory moment, and suddenly you're pulling out your credit card to book tickets for next year.
And we see the exact same mechanisms coded into digital products too. Take Duolingo.
Oh yeah, the owl.
Learning a new language is a long, repetitive, often frustrating middle. So how do they keep you coming back? They don't just quietly track your data. They engineer tiny, constant peaks.
Right, like the animations.
Exactly. A screen lights up because you hit a 3-day streak, or an animated character cheers for you because you answered 5 tough questions in a row. They manufacture peaks of pride.
Share the Meal, the charity app, does something similar, but with emotional resonance. When you donate money on a standard website, you usually just get a sterile text box saying, transaction approved.
Which is completely forgettable.
But Share the Meal takes that transactional ending and turns it into a profound peak. They show you exactly how many meals your specific donation provided alongside a photograph of a real person you are helping. It engineers this massive dopamine hit of empathy right at the finish line.
If we connect this to the bigger picture designing fireworks, and digital confetti is harmless enough, but we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room here. Utilizing a psychological loophole that systematically overrides a person's actual lived experience sounds incredibly manipulative.
Yeah, that brings up the darker side of this research. Like, can the peak end rule be weaponized? Because if you can essentially hack human memory to ignore a bad experience, that feels like a recipe for exploitation.
It absolutely can be weaponized. In behavioral design, we separate the application of these rules into white hat and black hat design.
Like hackers.
Exactly like hackers. And the most prominent and arguably devastating example of black hat peek-in design is found in the architecture of casinos.
The house always wins, but they have to make you feel good about losing.
That is the core mechanism. If you analyze a 2-hour slot machine session, the experiencing self is enduring a long, continuous middle of net financial loss. Minute by minute, your wallet is draining. But the casino masks this reality brilliantly. They engineer a massive sensory peak, a near miss, where all the lights flash, the sirens go off, and the machine vibrates, making your amygdala flood your system with a surge of adrenaline.
Even though you didn't actually win.
Exactly. And then they often program a graceful ending, like a small bonus payout or free spins, right before your budget fully runs out.
So you walk out the door completely broke, but your remembering self says, man, what a great night. I was so close to hitting the jackpot.
The experiencing self was systematically harmed financially, but the remembering self was manipulated into returning. It's the exact cognitive vulnerability that makes gambling addiction and certain forms of digital exploitation possible.
Wow. So how do you tell the difference? How does a product designer or even just a person running a business know if they are using this tool ethically?
There's a phenomenal integrity check for this, which we can call the white hat test. Imagine if a customer kept an honest, minute-by-minute diary of their experience with your product or service.
Okay, like writing down how they feel at 8.05, 8.15.
Right, at 8.25, and so on. At the end of the day, would their final memory, that peak end summary, be a fair, condensed version of that diary? Or would it be a flattering lie?
Oh, I see.
If the peak and the end camouflage a middle that actually frustrated, bored, or harmed the user, it's a lie and you are exploiting them. But if the peak is a genuine moment of mastery and the ending provides honest closure, then you are simply designing a good memory.
So what does this all mean for us, for the person listening to this right now? Knowing that our memory is being actively hacked by casinos, language apps, and theme parks is fascinating. But how can we use this rule to improve our own daily lives?
The personal applications are incredibly practical, actually, especially in professional settings. Consider the classic corporate meeting.
Oh, boy.
You have likely sat through a 90-minute strategy session where the first 80 minutes were phenomenal. Great ideas, fantastic synergy, real problem solving.
Yeah, we've all been there.
But then time runs out, people start checking their phones, someone brings up an entirely unrelated problem, and everyone just shuffles out of the room confused about what happens next.
And 6 months later, you remember that entire meeting as a catastrophic waste of time. The messy ending just rewrote the 80 minutes of good work.
Because the ending was chaotic, the structural boundary was tainted, the fix for this is simple peak end management. You protect the ending.
Protect the ending. How?
Reserve the last 5 minutes of every meeting for a rigid, untouchable wrap-up. What was decided? Who is doing what? What is one valuable insight we are taking away? That 5-minute ritual costs $0, but it fundamentally rewrites how the entire room remembers the collaboration.
That's brilliant. And it's amazing how that translates to our personal lives, too. The sources point out how duration neglect heavily distorts our view of relationships.
Oh, completely.
You could have a multi-year, deeply supportive partnership, thousands of hours of joy and growth. But if it ends in a bitter, explosive, unresolved argument, your remembering self acts like this dramatic editor. It takes those years of quiet, happy moments and just pastes over them with that one messy breakup at the end.
Yeah, the remembering self overwrites the long, pleasant duration with the intense negative ending. And you experience this on a micro scale with something as simple as your evening commute.
Right.
You can have a highly productive, fulfilling 8-hour workday, but if you get stuck in a frustrating, gridlocked traffic jam for the last 20 minutes on your way home...
You will walk through your front door, drop your bag, and tell your family you had a terrible day.
Exactly.
So are we just hostages to this? Is there any way to actually fight duration neglect? Or do we just have to accept that our memories are highly edited highlight reels?
We can fight it, or at least debias ourselves. Studies show that duration neglect isn't an unbeatable curse. When participants in experiments were forced to evaluate an experience using a visual graph, or if they were prompted to rate how they felt every 5 minutes instead of just waiting for the very end, the effect of duration neglect was significantly reduced.
Basically by making the invisible duration visible to the conscious mind.
Yes. When you make duration salient, when you actively remind your brain how long the good parts actually lasted, you can bring the remembering self closer to the reality of the experiencing self. Awareness of the bias is really the most important step to overcoming it.
Well, let's bring this all together. What we've learned from your notes today is that human memory is not a video recording. It is an emotional summary, ruthlessly edited down to just the peaks and the endings.
Right.
And whether you're a doctor trying to get patients to return for a life-saving screening, a UX designer trying to build a beloved app, or just a person trying to run a decent meeting, mastering those 2 moments is the key to mastering memory.
It really changes how you view every interaction, and I think it leaves us with a fascinating final thought to mull over.
What's that?
We have spent this time analyzing this as a bias, or a blind spot in our cognitive hardware. But the peak end rule evolved for a reason. Imagine if our brains actually operated like perfect, unfeeling spreadsheets. Imagine if we equally weighed every single boring average second of a 2-week vacation or a long creative project or even just raising a child.
That would be paralyzing.
Incredibly flat, monotonous, and paralyzing. If we lacked the ability to prioritize the highs and the final moments of closure, nothing would stand out from the background noise.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So maybe our brain's tendency to exaggerate the peaks and the endings isn't a hardware flaw at all. Maybe it is the exact mechanism that allows us to find meaning. It's what turns a mere biological sequence of events into an actual narrative.
It's what makes life feel like a story worth living. Next time you look back at that vacation or that old job or a past relationship, ask yourself, are you watching the raw footage of your life? Or are you just watching the highlight reel your editor decided to keep?